So,
It's
hello
still
everyone. We've just had a
it's,
fantastic check-in with about 38 people from all around the country come to listen to Rob Hopkins, one of the founders of the Transition Town movement, who's going to take us on a very interesting journey into the imagination and time traveling to hopefully better futures. So, Rob, over to you.
thank you, Phoenix. I still can't share screen.
Okay, let me try that again on the participants.
I want to show you some nice pictures.
Hopkins, more, make co-host, make co-host. Should have done it.
There we go. That's it. Beautiful.
Got it.
Right. Thank you. Well, hello everybody. Good evening, and lovely to see some old friends here and some amazing transition pioneers and people I've met at various other places around. And for those I haven't met, it's lovely to meet you all too. Always brilliant to spend time with people who are doing great stuff. And my wife's very involved with the climate hub down here in Totnes, and I think it's always really important to remember that actually, yes, there's Extinction Rebellion and there's the transition movement and there's climate emergency centres. It's very often the same people putting on different hats, and much power to everybody's elbows. And so yeah, as was said, I want to talk about imagination and time travel. And just to start by saying, recently the United Nations put out a study where they said any chance of staying below 1.5 degrees is now finished unless we see a rapid transformation of society, was their phrase. So every newspaper article led with headlines like this. Every magazine cover was like this: say goodbye to 1.5. I didn't see any magazine cover that said, why don't we have a rapid transformation of society? Let's do that rapid transformation of society. Not like it's working fantastically as it is at the moment, and we go so quickly from there's not a problem to it's too late, and so often neglect that piece that's kind of in the middle. And the Institute for the Future in the US, on their window, they have this statement: any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And I love it. And I'm really here, I guess, tonight to urge everybody to be a bit more ridiculous in the stuff that we do. And I recently spoke at a conference in Switzerland. There was 400 young people who were really passionate about organic food and farming. And there was a guy who spoke before me, who was from the biggest supermarket chain in Switzerland. And 4 times in his talk, he said, and I urge you all to be pragmatic. So when it came to me, I said, please don't be pragmatic. The last thing we need is for you to be pragmatic. I really, because any idea at this stage that doesn't appear at least a bit ridiculous is nowhere near ambitious enough. And so we absolutely need to up the ambition of what we're doing. And a lot of the work I do at the moment has been inspired by a T-shirt that I saw this young woman wearing at the Black Lives Matter protest in Washington. I've been to the future, we won. And it gave me goosebumps when I saw it. And I thought, how different would our activism be if we were a bit more like that? And I'm not for a moment saying we should all be out there like happy clappy evangelists, everything's going to be wonderful, because clearly the science is really not pointing in that direction. But at the same time, if all we do is talk about collapse and extinction and we don't give people something delicious to run towards, it's not going to happen. And Don DeLillo, in his book, book Underworld, he said longing on a large scale is what makes history. Longing on a large scale is what makes history. And so what I want to bring into this conversation today is, how could climate emergency centers be kind of seen as sort of longing generators, like so that after people step out from them, like they want to see that world more than anything else. And so what you might not know, you all know that Totnes is where the transition movement started. As Dirk said, Lewis came second, but actually what you don't know about Totnes is that we actually have a time travel program. We are the kind of the NASA of time travel down here, and we've been spending the last 6 or 7 years working on developing a time machine, and we now actually have a fully functioning time machine down here in Totnes. And myself and my colleague Kit here, we regularly take journeys into 2030, and it's important to remember, there are many different routes to different 2030s. 2030 is not cast in stone. The future is not cast in stone. And as Rilke the poet said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And so we travel to a 2030. It's not a utopia by any means. It's not a dystopia either. It's the 2030 that resulted from us doing absolutely everything we could possibly have done. And I think we often disconnect from that being a possibility, but we have to keep holding that and explaining to people how it is. And because I've been there quite regularly, I'm going to tell you about it. So you might like to think of me as the kind of Marco Polo, the sort of Phineas Fogg of the climate movement, if you like, because I've been to that 2030 and it's awesome. And I'm going to tell you about it. And we started a recent journey that we took there. We started with our time machine in this particular street. We set it up. We set the dials for 2030. We pressed go. And this is the 2030 that we stepped out into. Just in that short period of time, the change was extraordinary. The air smelled so much better. There was a stronger sense that people had of, do you know what? I think we might just make this, actually. The sort of cynicism and despondency of 2023 felt like it was a while back. The bird song was so much louder. We should always remember it took 10 years from Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus to the Civil Rights Act being passed in the US. A lot can happen in a short period of time when we get behind it and make that happen. And my friends, I have to tell you about the bicycle rush hours of 2030 that were the most awesome and moving thing to see. Rivers and rivers of bicycles, because by 2030 we had realized that for every £1 million we spent building cycling infrastructure, we saved £18 million off the national health bill. We now saw investing in green infrastructure as just that, an investment, not a cost, but as an investment in health, in well-being, in happiness. Now in 2030, when you cycle into the cities, you see signs like this. Remember, in 2023, we used to have these for cars to tell you where the car parking spaces were. Now they're all like that, but for bicycles. For some reason, they're all in Dutch. Something happened in 2025 that nobody wanted to talk to me about, but that's how it is. And now all of the what used to be underground car parks have been repurposed as these extraordinary, clean, well-kept, well-lit, safe places for people to leave their bikes. We built the infrastructure and people use it. Of course they did, because that's what we learn everywhere in the world where this happened. And when you think back to 2023, I remember in 2023 being in Merthyr Tydfil in Wales and seeing this. And if any cyclists among you can explain how on earth you're supposed to make use of that, really, I would love to hear from you, because I stood there looking at that for about 5 minutes and could not figure out what on earth I was supposed to actually do with it. So we actually embraced the idea of creating proper cycling infrastructure. In 2024, there was people told me stories about the great collapse of the worst of the speculative banks that happened there. This time we didn't bail them out. We brought them into national ownership. It meant that many of the banks and buildings and that infrastructure was brought into community ownership. One of the big shifts that we saw over the 7 years between 2023 and 2030 was the amount of buildings and infrastructure and businesses that were in community ownership rather than in private hands. This used to be a bank that we went to see. The upstairs of it now is a 300 people co-housing project, growing food on the roof with a forest there outside people's houses. This idea that communities need to own stuff became a completely commonplace idea very, very quickly, with some very pioneering examples. In terms of housing, we saw communities organizing themselves. We realized around 2023, 2024, there was no cavalry coming riding to our rescue in terms of the climate emergency. We needed to organize and get our shit together. And so this was in a community where crowdfunding would happen, and then they would buy a house, do it up, rent it out to a family that needed it, and then use the incomes from that to buy another one, and so on. And you saw this sort of virtuous sort of cycle building and building of communities feeling like things were possible. Every time there were new builds that were built, they were built using much more local materials. This explosion of people building using straw bale and clay and things that built a new economy around the place using local building materials. We even visited this 9-story apartment, social housing apartment block built using timber from the region. You could stand on top of here and you could look out across and see the forests where this came from. So this creation of a new economy took off really, really quickly with innovation, architects on board. It just took a few rules to be changed, and we unlocked a whole load of creativity and imagination. Everywhere we went, we saw streets that people had closed to cars, where the communities had organized and closed the streets to cars. In this particular street, people were very proud to show us this picture of what their street had looked like in 2023, now looked like this. And the site that gave me the most hope everywhere I went was that one of the biggest new creators of employment and business now in our towns and cities is getting rid of concrete and getting rid of tarmac, because we discovered that in those hot summers of 2022 and 2023, that when you get above 35, 36 degrees, concrete and tarmac kill people, and they kill people a lot because they hold so much heat in cities. So removing concrete and tarmac became a big thing. It allowed more water to drain in, allowed more space for biodiversity. So walking around the cities of 2030, they felt so much softer and kind of like they could breathe much more than they could before. We visited whole neighborhoods like this, redesigned now. So there is no room for cars. That sign means basically, if you need to drop stuff off in front of your house, you're shopping, you can drop it there, but you have to go and park somewhere else in a shared car park, which had solar panels on the roof. These streets designed for children, for cycling, just bicycles everywhere, cargo bikes. What we noticed was, because as I said before, we go there to make recordings of what that world sounds like. When you are in a whole part of a city now where there are no cars, it's so much quieter that you hear things that you couldn't hear in 2023. In this place, you could hear people having their piano lessons in their houses. You could hear people eating their dinner, because actually you couldn't do that before because the traffic just drowned everything out. And there is a car in that picture actually, but I think they just keep that throwing courgettes in and to show the kids what they're doing. But we go to these places and we make recordings of what it sounds like, because we think, well, if you can bring a recording of what 2023 2030 actually sounds like and bring those back and play them to people in 2023, that could really be one of the things that tips people's longing into making that world possible. We visited this extraordinary place, which was a school designed by the kids. An architect spent 2 years sitting with the kids to say, okay, you design a school that you would like. And it turns out that when you ask children to design their own school, they say they want their school to have a rainforest in the middle. And so this was a school that was created there. Now, this idea that children are much more involved in participating in their education, schools are much more democratic, education has been completely repurposed in the light of the climate emergency to teach for much different things. Agriculture has really shifted because we realize that we can't have an agricultural system that's going to depend on inputs, that's going to depend on large availability of water. So we see much more agroforestry, much more soil cover, much less animals. We realized in 2030 that we eat 80% less meat than we were eating in 2023. But do you know what? Nobody really even noticed that transition. It was pretty seamless and it didn't really cause any great upset to anybody. One of the things that we delighted in seeing was this place that we went to visit, where by 2030, people have developed the humility to recognize that beavers are much better hydrological engineers than human beings could ever possibly be. And so in all the uplands where the water would come pouring in and flooding our towns and cities back in 2023, we've now handed them over to beavers who have redesigned those landscapes so they hold massive amounts of water, and the biodiversity has just exploded in those places. And around our coasts as well, we've allowed the kelp forests to come back and created a whole new industry of producing. I think it's now up to about 30% of our protein comes from seaweed, which has created many jobs for coastal communities after where we moved away from fishing on a large scale. We see citizens' assemblies being used nationally, regionally, locally for all the big decisions that we need to make much more participatory democracy. Universities, this is the university that we went to, where every course now is taught through the lens of the climate and ecological emergency, giving people the practical skills to get on with it. Here, there was no lawn at all left around this university. The whole place had been put down to growing food, and young people were learning those skills. And every time that university needed a new building, the students built the building. This is a new classroom we went to, which was being built using more than 1,500 car tires that would otherwise end up in landfill, local timber, hemp lime blocks on the floor. And all the different courses were involved in building this and monitoring it and evaluating it. So it just ran through everything now. And this was a place that we went to, which was where a lot of things had started. It's always interesting in 2030 to go and visit places that were the pioneers and to see how they feel about the fact that what they started has now just become commonplace and mainstream. This is a town that we visited where in about 2018, the municipality bought this piece of land that was going to be turned into luxury housing, and they turned it into a market garden to grow food. And they grow 80% of all the food for all the schools in this area. And what they found was that it triggered a whole cultural shift in the community. The kids came out, were involved in the growing, the way the food was prepared changed. The big company, Sodexo, who'd had the contract before, got kicked out, and they put this new model in. This model has now spread absolutely everywhere. Those big companies that did school dinner contracts don't exist anymore. They went out of business around 2028, 2 years after Shell and BP filed for bankruptcy. And this model has now gone all over the place, rather like in the city of Liège in Belgium, the model they created which started in 2014, if any of you can remember back that far, where they decided they were going to build a food belt around the city. And already by 2018, they'd raised 5 million euros of investment from local people to start 27 cooperatives in that city to transform the food system. And by 2023, they were the model that was being used by the municipality to reimagine how they procured food for the schools, universities, and the hospitals. And already in 2023, that model had spread to 6 other cities in Belgium. This is now the completely new normal. This idea that we want to keep money circulating within our cities just became completely commonplace. Back in 2023, you might remember some people grumbling about air source heat pumps and, well, where are we going to find space for air source heat pumps? This was one of the places that we saw people were just using them instead of chimneys, putting them up on top of the roofs. The creativity and the engineering that was unlocked during this time to find solutions to things. All those people who said, "Oh, that's not possible, that's not possible." There's no such thing as impossible. We unlocked the creativity to do that. And of course, the kind of community, or the UK is now completely 100% reliant in energy. We use much less energy than we used to, but more than half of that energy is now in community ownership. A move developed by pioneers like in Lewis, like in Bath, like in Bristol, has now just become everywhere. Community energy went mainstream very, very quickly when the conditions were made for that to happen. So take a little breath at this point. It's going to sort of draw us back to 2023 to make a point that actually all of those things already exist. As William Gibson, the science fiction writer, said, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So all of those things already exist. That street we started in was in Amsterdam. The city with the bicycle rush hour is Utrecht in Holland. The bank repurposed was in a place I went in Switzerland. The place where the community is reorganizing for its own housing is in Grimsby, I think, or in Hull. The straw bale housing there is in Leeds. The tower block from local timber is in Grenoble in France. The school designed by the kids is in Madrid. The car-free neighborhood is in Vauban, the Vauban in Freiburg, and so on and so on. All of these things already exist. We're not waiting for someone to invent some amazing magic silver bullet. The question for me is, what were people doing back in 2023 that cultivated the longing that made that shift inevitable? Which feels the really important question to me. The first thing was that we realized we couldn't do this without artists. And I use artists in its broadest term: musicians, scriptwriters, street artists, graffiti painters, and artists like this. This is James Mackay at the University of Leeds, who draws the future. This is his drawing of saying, what would the future look like if we did everything we could possibly do? So this is his drawing of what if our cities were as biodiverse as they could possibly be. What if we took space back from cars and used that space in other ways? These images like this started to seep into our culture and permeate into our culture, and they created that longing, that deep desire, created a kind of a new North Star for people, that was what they wanted to do. And of course, Extinction Rebellion, I think our activism really sort of started to shift around this idea of what I like to call a pop-up tomorrow. You know, many of you will have been here. This is Waterloo Bridge in April 2019, when Waterloo Bridge got turned into a forest. And I've spoken to 4 people who've come up to me when I've shown this picture. Have come up to me after talks and said, yeah, I crossed Waterloo Bridge. I was working somewhere in London. I crossed the bridge when that was happening, and I stopped on that bridge and I saw that it was a forest, and I thought, why can't it always be like this? You know, it gave people a taste of a different way the future could be, and it created that longing in people, and all 4 of those people gave up their jobs doing whatever they were doing, and they now work in climate stuff and are involved in activism. I think that idea of a pop-up tomorrow, how do you take public visible space, whether it's a climate emergency center, whether it's Waterloo Bridge, and you use it to give people an immersive taste of how that future could be? What would it smell like? What does it sound like? What does it taste like? It's really important. Last year there was a group of people who for one day rewilded Trafalgar Square. And again, it's this idea of a pop-up tomorrow. You take a space people think they know really well, and for a short period of time, you transform it and you make it into what it could be in that future. Again, as Rilke said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens, is a really important thing, I think. This is in Bologna, in Italy, where the municipality runs something that's not called a civic participation office or a civic engagement office. It's a civic imagination office. It's explicitly designed to make imagination space for the people there. Really well facilitated, 6 laboratories around the city. People come together. The really brilliant bit is that when people come up with good ideas, the municipality will sit with them and say, that's a good idea. Let's make that happen. We can offer this and this and this. You can offer that. Good. Let's make a pact. And they've made hundreds of pacts now in Bologna between the people and the citizens. And I think things like this really matter because it gives people an experience of, well, a bit like transition does, that actually, well, people come together, they dreamt something, well, that exists now. And I'm sure, in Lewis and in many other places here where there are transition groups, you can point to things that exist because people came together and they imagined it. And giving people that experience is really important. This is in Cambridge, the Cambridge Imaginarium. I think we need to be creating a lot of these kind of pop-up, what I call a what-if space, taking public spaces. And there are people like Ruth Bentovim and Lucy Neal, who used to be an organization called Encounters, who created things called Encounters shops, which were pop-up places where people could just come in and share their thoughts and their ideas. These kind of spaces that invite people to come in and play and be imaginative are really precious and really important. This is, some of you might know these guys. This is Dan Edelstein and Hilary Powell in London, who had previously done a thing called the Bank Job, which is awesome. And check it out if you don't know about it. And their current project is called Power Station, where they're saying what should be happening in 2023 is that the government is just printing money to turn every street into a power station, every home into a power station, insulate every home, turn it into a power station. They're not doing it, so we'll do it. So they slept on their roof for 22 nights in December in order to raise, as a crowdfund, they raised £100,000. They're also, this is a recent coverage they had, they also are printing these incredible things that look like banknotes, but they're actually like limited edition artworks, and they sell for the denomination on the front. And they've raised about £100,000 with that as well. And they're starting the work. I was there the other week. They're starting now to install solar panels on their street. And it's for me, it's such a beautiful piece of like really, really grounded community activism that involves arts and creativity in a really playful kind of a way. In Camden in London, which is the first council to do a climate emergency, declare a climate emergency, and the first also to do a citizens assembly on climate, they opened this thing called Think and Do, which was like a climate emergency center, but very much around a kind of it was like a what if space. And so people came in and they were asked, there were all different groups were invited in. It was very much a space to harness people's ideas and what ifs and stories. They asked people to tell stories from 2030, and then they produced a version of their local free newspaper that was from 2030 that was distributed to every house in Camden. And one of the most exciting things they're doing at the moment is that they have just delivered the first imagination activist training to all of the key, to 42 of the key staff, and it's about to go to all the senior people. So they're actively trying to build imagination activists within that organization through a really brilliant training run by someone called Phoebe Tickell, who I really recommend for a future one of these meetings. And you can download the report that she's done about that program. So just to come back to our time traveling thing, what do we do with the time traveling thing? So this is myself and Kit, who you saw earlier, and I go and visit places that already sound like the future needs to sound like, many of the places that I've shown you here, and I make recordings of what they sound like, and then work with Kit, who makes beautiful kind of ambient music pieces using those recordings, and my brief to him was that they should cultivate a nostalgia for the future. And I feel like that's one of the things that we need to be doing with climate emergency centers as well, to inform people, absolutely, but also to be cultivating a nostalgia for the future, because without that we're really not going anywhere. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Hopefully we have some time for questions. If you want to find out anything else about what I do, my blog is robhopkins.net. If you're new to transition and you're wanting to get started with transition, there's a great thing called the Essential Guide to Doing Transition, which you'll find on the Transition Network website. Transition Together, which is the hub for England and Wales, which is doing great work with that, will be launching a seed funding program in November, where you can apply for, I think, up to 5,000, maybe up to £10,000 for projects. So keep an eye out for that. Follow Transition Together on social media, and I do a podcast called From What If to What Next, which comes out every 2 weeks, and each episode explores a different what if question. And if you felt inspired by this and you wanted to subscribe to that, it's only £3 a month, and it really helps the work that I do. And hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions. And thank you so much for your attention this evening.
Absolutely inspiring. Thank you so much, Rob. That's incredible. Long fan of time travel, and we really need to imagine better futures. I'd love the link to the woman you said, is it Phoebe, who's doing the Camden's centre of where we started a lot of stuff years ago. Imagination activism. If you put that in, that'd be great. So if anyone's got any questions for Rob there, it helps facilitating. If you've got down the bottom, there's a reactions tab. And you can raise a hand like that, and then we can see who's 1, 2, and 3. So go to the reactions tab just down the bottom and raise or lower your hand when you're finished. If you've got a question there for Rob, I'll lower my hand. You can try sticking your hand up like that, but it's easier to see if you've used the reactions tab. So Dirk, I think first off, over to Sonny Lewis. Dirk, for a question.
Yeah, Rob, I was just wondering, since you're in Totnes, what do you do about climate deniers and conspiracy theorists? Do you think they're going to increase in numbers?
Hi Dirk, lovely to see you. Been far too long, and thank you so much for interrupting Jacob Rees-Mogg. I glowed with pride all day at the fact that I knew you when I saw that. It's always a tricky question, isn't it? I feel like I have had over the years quite a lot of overlap with those people, because I sometimes appear in some of their conspiracies. It's always a good way of knowing how much nonsense it is when you actually find yourself appearing in some of those. So there's some great conspiracy theories about the transition movement. We had our own page on David Icke's website for a little while about how we were funded by the United Nations. I always thought, oh God, I wish we were funded by the United Nations. That would be amazing. It always seems like one of those things where if you ignore it, they keep growing. And if you try to reason with it or confront it, it kind of follows you home shouting at you like a sort of a drunk at a bus stop. And so I think my current approach to it is to look at it as being like when someone stops you in the street and says, is there room for Jesus in your life? It's like it's a kind of a cultish. It's like how should we respond to people to cults? It's a cult. And so how do we respond to cults? I don't know. It's like, it feels like if you ignore it, it grows. If you confront it, it grows. And I think, we had an event where a big Transition Town Totnes event with the Climate Hub, where we had people outside kind of handing out letters to everybody who came with all of this stuff in it. And I went out to the woman, I said, you do realize that every single thing in your letter is untrue? And she said, but I believe it to be true. I said, well, that's not the same, but that's not the same thing, is it? So I don't know. My own approach is just to avoid it and treat it in the same way that one might a really kind of extremist sort of cult. But whether that's the strategy, I don't know. I don't have a magic answer to that question, sadly. I wish I did. Although I will just add, actually, I will just add one thing, which is that we did see, particularly in the early days of transition, a couple of transition groups that were really destroyed by that. Like people from that way of thinking who got inside and just sort of completely these groups just fell to bits in sort of disharmony. And so I think it's something that's really important that we're vigilant to, and there are certain signs to look out for. I think we know that we shouldn't allow some of that stuff really in the heart of the things that we're doing. James.
Hi, Rob. That is just so utterly inspiring. I find I get very depressed very regularly, and hearing you just so eruditely and eloquently, be optimistic and forward thinking is absolutely fantastic. The thing that drags me down is when Rishi Sunak just gives 100 or more gas and oil licenses in the North Sea, and anything we try to do locally seems to just pale into complete insignificance where in face of that. Do you think it's the duty or part of our remit in what we do, either as transition towns or as local activists and green party people or whoever we vote for, to challenge this and try and bring this down legally? Because this is cynical, personal gain. I mean, when we hear that his family, his father-in-law 2 months ago made a pact, £1 billion deal with BP. This is absolutely obviously personal. And what's your view on that?
My view on that is that nobody knows what the thing is that is going to tip this. If we did, we'd all be doing that thing. I've spent the last couple of years, I in meetings with people from XR saying, what should we be doing? People from Just Stop Oil and people from Transition. Everybody's like asking, what's the next thing that we need to be doing? I always say, I feel like we need a really big, bold and beautiful yes, and we need a big, bold, beautiful no. So I have so much respect and admiration for people who put themselves out there, and people who are happy to getting arrested. My wife's been arrested 7 times now with XR, and I have every admiration, and young people who are doing that. Awesome. And then also the people who are bringing the legal challenges, the people who are doing the divestment, the people who are campaigning against any time when oil and gas tries to sort of glam itself up by sponsoring something big, like the arts and so on. But at the same time, we have to be, for me, I'm not involved in XR, so I don't feel like it's for me to come in and make criticisms of XR, because XR's been phenomenal and is kind of our biggest chance that we have of getting lots of people out on the streets about this. But I felt early on there was this narrative about it's not for us to be suggesting what the future could be like. And I felt like that was a bit of a missed opportunity to be really sort of trying to bring some magic into people's imaginations about what that might be. And I'm sure there were very good reasons for that, but that felt so for me, the work that the transition movement is doing about trying to build what comes next, and not just the transition movement, the sort of the local food movements and the community energy movements, all of that stuff is really important too. And I would always I mentioned the story of Liège in Belgium, where they're doing this Liège food belt thing. There's a really good piece about 2 weeks ago in the Guardian. I don't know if someone could just quickly Google that and stick it in the chat, but there was a great article on the Guardian's website about the project in Liège. And it's really important to remember that project started with about 5 people like yourselves sitting around a table saying, should we do this then? All right, let's do it and see what happens. And now that idea is spreading and becoming the mainstream in Belgium, and in many, many French cities now are taking this approach as well, of saying the food for schools, universities and hospitals, we should be growing it locally and building a whole new infrastructure to do that. You can trace that back to those people doing that. So never underestimate the power of things that we do as communities, because you never know where that story is going to go and who it's going to inspire. But we need all of this, and we need it about 1 million times more, and we need it much better funded and resourced, and we're all exhausted and we've all got no resource and money to do things. So we need all of those different things. But I feel like unless we have that thing to run towards, it makes it an awful lot harder. Helen.
Just a little bit on Liège, it is somewhere where I once stayed a night, and it was horrendous because the city centre was used as a motorbike racetrack all night long. So it's not that Liège is a nice, sleepy little town. It's just an ordinary bog standard city. So yeah, amazing. That wasn't what I was going to say, but I just thought I'd mention it. I think that there's something that we can all do, and I'm guilty of it. I live in Andrea Jenkins ward, Brexit Central of Leeds. It's very easy for me to go and get involved with the CEC, which does things in the centre of town or tends to be a little bit in the studenty, greeny, laboury area of town. Maybe we've just got to be brave and say, I'm going to show Rob's film, and just put it on as a film night and invite people into your home. I think we've got to take those brave steps.
Thank you. Yeah, about Liège, the mayor of Liège made me an honorary citizen of Liège, and gave me a very nice sort of medal thing. And I said, well, thank you, that's very nice. Could I have my European citizenship back as well? He said, oh, Mr. Hopkins, I'm afraid this is not within my power. And he said, because he said basically before this happened, everybody thought Liège was a bit shit. And now everybody thinks Liège is really, really cool. And everywhere you go, you're like an ambassador talking about how great Liège is. Yeah, I mean, there is a really important element here, which is about, what does this stuff look like in marginalized working class communities and places that are left behind? And the point is, this in that 2030 that I've just taken you to, the transition in its widest sense is now by far the biggest source of new employment in all those places, of investment, of jobs, of innovation, of creativity. And people are healthier, and they're happier, and their kids are less stressed, and their mental health is much improved. It's like we have to look at all of this and really kind of join it up and connect it. But I think that's the argument we need to be making much more. I'm part of a project here in Totnes that I've been part of for a very long time, which is called Atmos Totnes, where the community is trying to become its own developer on a derelict brownfield site. And it's been a long fight, but we're nearly there. And that's like the community providing 67 truly affordable homes for local people in a way that creates lots of jobs and employment. We need to be thinking about how does this stuff create jobs for people? Because if we don't create jobs for people, then it remains a kind of middle class pursuit, really.
Okay, really inspiring, Rob. I just started bung a couple of bits in there. It's, we started a project back in 2009 at the Copenhagen Climate Summit called Solution Zone TV, and it really was about asking many different people just for a quick 3-minute, what do you think the solutions are, from Spanish Friends of the Earth to Swedish MPs, and we got some incredible answers. We've been putting them all down on a Facebook group I'll put in there for the last 10 plus years, and we create something called Global Solutions Day. We also at the first Climate Emergency Centre had an ongoing project we have called the Eco Solutions Exhibition, and we wrote it into the handbook. It really, really is. Climate emergency centres are about solutions. They are imagination spaces for the future, but not just that, having practical, real examples of solutions in there, from wind and solar power to bike generators to displays about permaculture, whatever it is. We really need to show green transition and all of these things. So wherever you are out there, at whatever stage you are of getting your building, please start to highlight the solutions, have the spaces for those solutions, create the displays for those solutions, put them on, TVs in the corner, whatever it is. And, slowly we get the imagination of the better futures we can have, such as, illustrated brilliantly there with Rob's time travel. Over to Tony from Talking Tree.
Hi there, thanks Rob, and yeah, really inspiring. I think there is a sort of tension, isn't there, as you sort of touched on, between sort of protesting against the system and trying to change the system, which is very hard work and often seems a futile task given the scale of what we're up against. But then on the other side, just sort of creating alternative realities, which is something that in many ways seems much more doable, because actually I think people can do that. So I think one of the roles of climate emergency centres is providing an example of the way things could be, the way things could be organised. But yeah, I'm working on a project at the moment called the New Villages Project. I'm doing a talk at the lead up to the Local Futures Summit in Bristol that's coming up at the end of September. And yeah, I'd be really interested to talk to people about that, tell them a bit more about that, because I think it's just about really taking the first steps to find ways to make the alternative a more mainstream option, rather than just often what we're often presented as a sort of an exclusive minority, aren't we? That's the way the right-wing press like to portray us, and I think trying to break down that barrier and create something that is really positive and more mainstream is very important. And I think the way that a lot of crises are coming together, the housing crisis in particular, and the crisis that's going to be with us very soon around food. I mean, already the issue of affordability of food is a big issue for a lot of people, but I think those sort of areas we need to create alternative solutions quite quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to post something in the chat actually, which is there's a really, I'm sure many of you will know Polly Higgins, who came up with the idea of ecocide, which is a really, really important idea. But what you might not know about was that in parallel to creating that idea, she also created the idea of what she called the Transition Enabling Act, which was to say, she said, you know, we did a big event in London where she came up with this idea, and she said, you know, in the early 1800s, the Victorians created something that was called the Canal Enabling Act. The Canal Enabling Act basically said, right, we need to build canals really quickly. What are the blockages to us building canals really quickly? Let's put all of those blockages into a piece of legislation, and then get that piece of legislation passed through that removes all those blockages. So there are legal precedents for that happening. She said what we need is a transition enabling act which identifies all of the blockages to that, so that this can emerge, can happen and accelerate really, really quickly. So I've just posted an article there which includes some of what she said about it, and some, yeah, a kind of an update on that idea. So you might find that useful. Julian.
Thanks, Rob. Rob, good to hear from you again. So I think transition and CECs and climate majority project and things have a similar aim. Lots of villages and cities in particular, I know, are doing good stuff. I just wondered if you had any particular inspiration for those towns in the middle that, you know, maybe no university, not especially prosperous, lots of commuters and things like that. What are the most inspiring things you've seen in towns of that type?
I mean, I think one of the keys that can unlock a lot in different places is something like the Preston model. You know, that idea that you redesign the economy of a place to ensure that money circulates as many times as possible there before it leaves. And in Preston, they've found that has been really, really transformative, and similar in Liège with their food model. And what it does is it opens up some great sort of thinking then about connection. And in Preston, they've developed this idea of insourcing. So rather than outsourcing everything with tenders to private contractors, they insource. So they identify, well, if we've got to renovate this housing estate, how many unemployed electricians are there living on this housing estate? You know, could we, rather than putting out one big tender to renovate this housing estate, how could we put it out as a number of smaller tenders that mean that more local contractors can do that work and more money can stay locally? You know, and then when you apply that to food, like they're doing in Liège, or you start applying it to energy, you know, it's interesting that there are some cities who seem to be in a kind of a race sort of become the low carbon city quicker than others. I think Nottingham is doing some amazing stuff in terms of building kind of affordable low carbon housing. You know, the thing with all of this is that you can find everything that you need somewhere. So everything is working somewhere. So it's not, like I said before, we're not waiting for anyone to invent anything amazing, but it seems like places specialize. We need everywhere to be doing all the different bits. I guess for me, I increasingly moved towards thinking that actually the solutions on the scale of the urgency that we need aren't going to come from central government. They're going to come from regional government, local government, business and communities working together in new ways, and we need to be finding the ways to bring people together that enables that to happen. Liz.
That was exactly what I was going to say. I was just going to say that Antonio Guterres said that we need everything or everywhere all at once, and I think we do. We need everything, and I think as green organisations we need to come together, and we all need to be singing from the same song sheet. And I think the change where it's going to happen is from the bottom. I think it's going to be grassroots, and I think that if we all do what we can and create resilient communities, I think change can really happen. So thank you, Rob. It's been really inspirational.
Thank you, my pleasure. And yeah, I would just say that the thing, you know, like you saw in the photograph that I showed at the end, you know, where of us in our time traveling apparel, you know, the reason that we wear that isn't to protect us. The reason that you wear, like when you do time traveling and you go forward like that, the reason you have to wear that stuff is to protect the people there, so that you don't kind of pollute what's happening there with the sort of 2023 cynicism and sort of despondency, because actually by 2030 there is this sort of fragile but very real sense of, do you know what, I think we might just be doing this feels absolutely exhilarating and completely extraordinary. And so we have to, we're in the training that you do to be a time traveler. Part of it is that you have to learn about, and that you can't do any past splaining. So you can't go and say, well, that's never going to work or anything like that. You know, it's that actually the thing that I always try to impress on people is that if we do all of those things, you know, to go back to what I said at the beginning, you know, rapid transformation of society. What would it feel like to live through a rapid transformation of society? We've not really lived through one in our lives in that, like in a positive way. We've lived through daft ones like Brexit and things like that. We've not lived through a sort of a positive rapid transformation of society, which exists on the outskirts of possibility, but it absolutely still exists. And so what I always try to get across to people is, like, what an extraordinary thing to live through a revolution of the imagination whenever anything felt possible. That's the thing that I hold on to. God, that would be amazing.
Absolutely beautiful. It really does need a revolution of the imagination. And sometimes I feel like we've got a big lack of imagination about what we could do in the future. And climate emergency centres are blank canvases for the possibility of creating better futures. Thank you so much, Rob. I've always been interested in time travel. In fact, I'm going to put one last post in here from a community I visited in northern Italy, and they say they've been time traveling for a long time. And Sam and her community, absolutely incredible community, very new age, but like Glastonbury of Italy. But they talk about time being a sea of now, and that they can visit through kind of like astral projection different parts of the sea of now. So let's hope that you know, in the future, wherever that is across you know, things are going to be a lot better for a lot of people if we have the imagination. And what we're doing with climate emergency centres is creating the infrastructure for those sustainable futures and spaces where we can imagine them and have the physical spaces to meet and to organise and to get together. So thank you very much to everyone for coming. I'll leave the parting word to Rob Hopkins. Thank you for being such a massive inspiration to many people, Rob. And let's get imagining those futures. And thank you very much for sharing the time travel. Over to Rob for parting comments. Over.
Oh, I don't really have any. Just to say thank you all so much for giving some time this evening, and deepest respect for everything that you do. And yeah, thank you, and enjoy your dinner, and see you all again soon, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great stuff. Take care, guys. Happy time travel.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. That was great.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Stop recording.
Right. Thanks, Phoenix, for organising everything.
Thank you, Rob, for being an inspiration to the nation.